She thought she could harass an elderly black man because of his skin color, but his real identity shocked her. The gate at Liberty International Airport buzzed with the usual pre-flight chaos. Families wrestled with carry-ons, business travelers tapped furiously on laptops, and the air thrummed with the anticipatory energy of journeys about to begin. Gate B27 was specifically for SkyNova Airlines, Flight 342 to Atlanta, a route as ordinary as Tuesday morning itself. Here, in the crowded, brightly lit space, no one was anyone special, just passengers waiting their turn. Elijah Vance stood slightly apart from the bustle, a tall, well-built black man in his late 40s. Dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored dark suit, he held a slim briefcase and observed the scene with calm, steady eyes. There was a quiet dignity in his posture, a practiced competence in the way he moved, as if he was accustomed to navigating busy spaces with effortless grace. He could have been any executive catching a routine flight, blending seamlessly into the anonymity of the modern airport crowd, utterly unassuming. Boarding call announced, Elijah joined the queue, moving with the same quiet efficiency he displayed earlier. As he reached the aircraft door, a white air hostess, all bright, practiced smiles for the previous passengers, glanced at Elijah and her smile seemed to hitch, becoming a fraction tighter, less genuine. Her name tag read, Brenda. "Boarding pass, sir?" Brenda requested, her tone brisk, almost curt, lacking the warmth she'd shown moments before. As Elijah presented his pass, Brenda scanned it quickly, her eyes flicking over him again, lingering a moment too long on his face. "Seat 2A, she stated, pointing vaguely down the aisle without making eye contact. As he passed, Elijah overheard her murmur something to the gate agent behind her, a low phrase ending in, "First class, imagine." It was soft, almost imperceptible, but the dismissive tone was unmistakable, laced with a subtle mockery that pricked the air. Elijah continued down the aisle, his expression unchanged. A flicker of something, annoyance, disappointment, might have crossed his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He found his seat, 2A in first class, settled his briefcase in the overhead compartment with practiced movements, and then took his seat with quiet grace. He fastened his seatbelt, his gaze forward, seemingly unfazed by the subtle sting of Brenda's dismissive behavior, a picture of composed indifference. As passengers continued to board, Brenda moved through the first-class cabin, offering pre-flight drinks with a practiced, if somewhat strained, smile to the other, mostly white, passengers. When she reached Elijah, her smile vanished completely. "Anything for you, sir?" she asked, the "sir" delivered with a noticeable emphasis that bordered on sarcastic. Before Elijah could answer, she added, "We have water or, well, just water actually, for, up here right now," again that subtle needling tone suggesting he was out of place. Brenda's attitude wasn't just hers alone. Elijah noticed a few curious glances from other first-class passengers, quick, assessing looks that seemed to categorize him, to wonder if he belonged. One older white gentleman in a pinstripe suit even chuckled softly, shaking his head as Brenda moved away from Elijah, as if sharing a private joke about the perceived incongruity of Elijah's presence in first class. It was a silent language of shared assumptions, a feeling in the air that this space, this privilege, wasn't truly meant for someone like him. They saw his skin color first, and their ingrained prejudices filled in the rest of the story for them, a story where he was an anomaly, an exception, perhaps even an interloper. Brenda's attitude wasn't just hers alone. Elijah noticed a few curious glances from other first-class passengers, quick, assessing looks that seemed to categorize him, to wonder if he belonged. One older white gentleman in a pinstripe suit even chuckled softly, shaking his head as Brenda moved away from Elijah, as if sharing a private joke about the perceived incongruity of Elijah's presence in first class. It was a silent language of shared assumptions, a feeling in the air that this space, this privilege, wasn't truly meant for someone like him. They saw his skin color first, and their ingrained prejudices filled in the rest of the story for them, a story where he was an anomaly, an exception, perhaps even an interloper. As the final passengers boarded, Brenda returned to the first-class cabin, ostensibly to do a final check before takeoff. She paused beside Elijah's seat, her voice suddenly louder, more performative, as if for the benefit of the other passengers now settling in. "Sir," she began, her tone dripping with false concern, "are you sure you're in the right seat? First class can be a little confusing for some. She gestured around the cabin with a sweeping hand, a gesture that subtly included and excluded simultaneously, including the other, white, passengers in a knowing glance, and pointedly excluding Elijah. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, a ripple of unease in the cabin air, while the older gentleman in the pinstripe suit coughed, trying to suppress a chuckle. Elijah's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on the armrest. The casual dismissiveness had morphed into outright public insinuation, a deliberate attempt to humiliate him in front of the other passengers. Inside, the simmer of irritation flared hotter, closer to a boil. Decades of navigating prejudice, of swallowing microaggressions and outright insults with practiced composure, strained against the raw affront of this blatant disrespect. He felt a cold knot of anger tighten in his chest. "This is enough," a voice whispered inside him, sharp and clear. But outwardly, his face remained a mask of calm, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Brenda, misinterpreting his silence as compliance, leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a stage whisper, laced with sugary condescension. "Perhaps," she suggested, tilting her head with exaggerated helpfulness, "there's been a little mistake with your ticket? Maybe you meant to be in Economy Plus? We can certainly check for you. Wouldn't want you to be uncomfortable up here if you're not accustomed to it." With that final, barbed word, accustomed, something shifted within Elijah. It wasn't just the word itself, but the smug, knowing look on Brenda's face, the barely concealed triumph in her eyes, that snapped the last thread of his patience. The performance was over. The game was about to change. Slowly, deliberately, Elijah unbuckled his seatbelt. He turned in his seat, swiveling to face Brenda fully for the first time since boarding. His movements were unhurried, almost languid, yet they possessed a quiet authority that instantly commanded attention. The subtle rustle of his suit, the soft click of the seatbelt buckle releasing, seemed to amplify in the sudden hush that fell around them. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, even devoid of anger, yet it carried a weight that cut through the cabin noise. "Excuse me," Elijah said, his gaze steady, unwavering, locked directly onto Brenda's startled face. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." He paused fractionally, letting the words hang in the air. "You seem to be making certain assumptions about my presence here in first class." Brenda's practiced smile vanished completely, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then a dawning unease. The older gentleman in the pinstripe suit coughed again, this time not with amusement, but with a distinct discomfort. The subtle whispers and glances that had filled the cabin moments before ceased abruptly. A palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere, the smug certainty of the superior group faltering, replaced by a nervous, uncertain silence. Brenda's confident posture seemed to shrink just slightly, her eyes widening almost imperceptibly. Elijah reached into his inside jacket pocket, the movement smooth and deliberate. He withdrew a slim, leather card holder. Instead of presenting a ticket or identification, he flipped it open to display a gleaming gold card. Embossed in elegant lettering beneath a stylized wing logo were the words, "Skynova Airlines, Chairman's Circle." Below that, in even smaller print, his name, Elijah Vance, Chairman and CEO. He held the card out, not aggressively, but with quiet, undeniable authority, letting the light catch the gold, making sure Brenda, and anyone else who cared to look, could clearly see. At the same instant, as if on cue, Elijah's phone, which had been silently vibrating in his pocket, chose that exact moment to ring. He glanced at the screen. Jillian Vance, Chief of Operations, and with a subtle nod towards Brenda answered, "Jillian, yes, boarding is just completing now, everything proceeding smoothly on the ground." "Good. Any word from Atlanta about the personnel issue we discussed?" "Excellent. Keep me updated." He ended the call with a decisive click and returned his phone to his pocket. Brenda's eyes widened, fixated on the gold card. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin ashen. Her carefully constructed composure crumbled, replaced by raw, unfiltered shock. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Recognition dawned in her eyes, a horrifying understanding of the enormity of her mistake, the depth of her misjudgment. The blood seemed to rush to her cheeks in a hot wave of shame, battling with the lingering pallor of her initial shock. Her hands, which had been confidently gesturing moments before, now fluttered nervously, unsure where to land. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly. The arrogance that had radiated from her just moments ago was completely extinguished, replaced by a rapidly escalating fear. Her eyes darted around the cabin, as if seeking some escape, some way to rewind the last few minutes, but finding none. The other passengers, those who had witnessed the exchange, now stared at Brenda with a mixture of shocked fascination and dawning disapproval. The older gentleman in the pinstripe suit suddenly found intense interest in the airline safety card in front of him. His earlier smugness utterly vanished. Elijah slowly closed the cardholder and returned it to his pocket, his movements deliberate, each action underlining his calm command. He turned his gaze back to Brenda, his expression still neutral, but now imbued with a quiet, unmistakable authority that resonated throughout the suddenly silent cabin. "Now," he said, his voice calm and even, yet carrying a new weight of command, "perhaps we should discuss this misunderstanding you seem to think has occurred." The power dynamic had flipped completely, instantly. He was no longer just a passenger. He was in charge. Elijah stood, slowly and deliberately, his gaze sweeping across the stunned first-class cabin before settling back on Brenda. "Ms. Brenda," he began, his voice now carrying the unmistakable weight of command, "your behavior from the moment I stepped onto this aircraft has been unacceptable. Not just unprofessional, but deeply and personally offensive." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Skynova Airlines," he continued, his voice resonating with quiet power, "is built on principles of respect, dignity, and inclusivity. We pride ourselves on connecting people, on bridging divides, not creating them." He gestured subtly to himself. "My presence in first class or anywhere on my airline should not be a source of confusion or amusement or thinly veiled contempt. It should be expected. It is expected. Because Skynova is for everyone, regardless of background, regardless of appearance." Elijah's gaze hardened slightly, focusing solely on Brenda. "Therefore," he stated, each word measured and precise, "effective immediately, your employment with Skynova Airlines is terminated." The words hung in the air, stark and absolute. "Please disembark from this aircraft now." He gestured towards the exit with a subtle inclination of his head. "Security will escort you from the premises and ensure your belongings are returned to you." There was no anger in his voice, just cold, decisive finality. He had spoken, and his judgment was absolute. Brenda stood frozen, the color completely drained from her face. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her carefully applied makeup. A tremor ran through her body, and she seemed to shrink inwards, as if physically collapsing under the weight of Elijah's words and the collective gaze of the cabin. Shame and fear warred on her face, a raw, exposed vulnerability replacing the mask of smug superiority she had worn just moments before. Humiliation burned in her cheeks, hot and undeniable. A collective breath seemed to exhale from the other passengers. The silence in the cabin was thick, heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Some passengers avoided Brenda's gaze, a mixture of pity and discomfort in their eyes. Others watched her with open disapproval, their earlier complicity in her subtle mockery now replaced by a dawning understanding of the ugliness of prejudice laid bare. Even the older gentleman in the pinstripe suit looked down, shamefaced, at the safety card he still clutched, the ghost of his earlier smirk completely erased. A ripple of change, of uneasy self-reflection, stirred in the cabin air. Elijah's actions, swift and just, resonated beyond the immediate moment. It was a stark reminder that behind appearances, behind assumptions, lay the complex reality of individual worth and dignity. Respect, he had demonstrated, was not a matter of hierarchy or perception, but a fundamental human right, and its violation would have consequences, even at 30,000 feet. A year later, the story of Flight 342 to Atlanta had become something of an internal legend within Skynova Airlines, whispered in hushed tones, especially among new recruits during their diversity and inclusion training. The air within Skynova had palpably shifted. It wasn't just about policies on paper, it was felt in the interactions between staff, the genuine warmth in customer service, and the open, diverse faces that now graced Skynova's promotional materials. Complaints regarding discriminatory behavior had plummeted, replaced by commendations for exceptional, respectful service across all departments. Elijah, in his role as chairman, had spearheaded a company-wide initiative called Wings of Respect, implementing mandatory unconscious bias training, diverse hiring practices, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. He personally addressed employees at town halls, sharing his vision for an airline where everyone felt valued and respected. Sky Nova, once just another airline, began to be recognized not only for its service and routes, but for its commitment to inclusivity, becoming a benchmark within the industry. Bel Andreas, as Skynova's internal moniker became known, was no longer just about flying, it was about uplifting. And so, Skynova Airlines truly took flight, soaring beyond its routes and destinations to embody a powerful message. That true excellence is not just about reaching new heights in the air, but in fostering respect and understanding on the ground, proving that even a single act of standing up for dignity can ripple outwards, transforming not just an airline, but perhaps, in a small way, the world. Have you ever been in a situation where you saw someone being abused or mistreated? Share your experience in the comments. If you enjoyed this and want more content on Inspiring Black Stories channel like this, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and remember, real courage is not fearing the consequences, but prioritizing justice over comfort.